Hi everyone. Before we get started today, I just want to remind you that we've got 14-day free trials available for our Chronicles Tifosi Patreon membership at the moment. So if you're listening to this as a snippet from the podcast and you think, hey, I'm enjoying this content, I'd like to listen to the full episode, you can get that 14-day free trial right now on Patreon. Give us a try, see if you like us, and hopefully you'll hang around and listen to the full thing. You can find that at seriechronicles.com/Patreon. And as I said, you can subscribe to get membership for free for 14 days. I want to say a quick thank you as well to everyone who's given us a rating and review recently on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Facebook, and YouTube. Our producer Simon put out a call to action for our Tifosi, and you've all been incredibly kind with those reviews. So thank you all for doing that and for supporting the show. Producer Simon, by the way, was on the latest episode of the Gentleman Ultra podcast. If you'd like to have a listen to that, and I will be on there very soon as well. Right, that's enough of the pre-show. Let's get into the real show. It's, of course, me, Nicky Bandini. And for the first time in a whole week, I have back with me Mina Rzouki. Mina, how was your holiday?
Oh, it was fantastic, Nikki. Other than the fact that I look like I've come back like needing a hospital, I have a
You look so tan. You look so tan.
I got so burnt. You don't understand. I'm sort of used to like European sun, which is, not that bad, And I went and I put my factor 50. I lay down in the sun and I got burnt within 2 hours, which never happens to me, by the way. Never happens to me because I've got quite, like my skin darkens quite well. And I just...
Everyone get your tiny violins out for Mina and her malicious suffering. She got burned while someone was bringing her a cocktail on the beach. She got a little bit too hot. It was awful.
Yeah, that's so true, by the way. Yeah, get out the mini violins, you stupid cow. I feel like that's what everyone really wants to tell me. I understand, It was. I can't explain it to you. When you go on holiday, you're just so excited for all these things, and I've walked out with like 42 bug bites from mosquitoes. Okay, my skin at the back is peeling so heavily. I kind of just look like I've gone and killed myself and come back, But it was an exceptional time away. I am so sorry that I wasn't here to do the show, although there's a part of me that sort of is happy to have missed all of Italy's games, considering what's been on show.
Goodness sake,
Again,
Mina, did you not interrupt your beach time to check out Italy's 2-0 win over Malta? No comment.
I know it was supposed to be really into Italian football, but it was just like this feeling where I've just like, and not only that, I was watching a show, I was listening to one of the podcasts, I don't know whether it was ESPN or somebody else, and they said, what do you think Italy will do since they never qualify for a World Cup? And I thought, you know what, let me just take a break from all of this. Like, I don't want to sit here and watch another Italian disaster or whatever it is. So yes, it was nice to have that break. Although I did sort of enjoy hearing everything about Antonio Conte and you know me. Anything that's a little bit bitchy and I'm on top of it, And I did sort of want to come out and tweet, like same old Conte, but I left
Mina's
it alone.
Ideal holiday is what I learned. Mina's ideal holiday: beach, sunbed. What I've heard before we started, Mina was doing some zip lining, some horse riding, all of that, and then just like a little bit of shade being thrown at Antonio Conte, maybe Pep Guardiola as well for the perfect holiday.
Oh, that would be wonderful. It was Pep as well. I couldn't get that lucky.
We will get to Conte for sure. We will talk about Antonio Conte. We should start off talking about Italy, Mina, because that has been the main thing. I know you. I certainly don't blame you for not interrupting your beach holiday to watch the games live, but you're all caught up on everything that's happened in qualifying, aren't you?
Unfortunately, I had to go and sit through the extended highlights, but that is the England one was. I was very upset with that first half, but for Malta it was okay. Well, better.
Yeah, I mean, look, just to sort of give my sort of snap thought on it, like I've seen some people going, oh, only 2-0 against Malta, and I mean, like, take that in isolation rather than the big picture which we're about to get to, but like, I don't care that they only beat Malta 2-0. Italy has never beaten little teams in qualifying. That's a tale as old as time. Italy in qualifying only beating minnows by a couple of goals doesn't bother me in the slightest. They won the game and it was never really in jeopardy. I know there was that chance after like 4 minutes, which I know I had to make a save on, but come on, the game was never an interesting game, and that's fine. That's what it needs to be. They needed to win the game. They lost to England. They needed to win the game. But big picture, I think is where we can focus on. I obviously already did a voice note after the England game. Big picture is 2 games into the group, 3 points. As I said after the England game, qualifying is a lot less scary than it used to be. Top 2 will go through. Even if Italy do fall out of the top 2, they've got an extra chance to qualify through and the playoffs because they got that through Nations League. And so I'd like to hope qualifying is going to be all right, but we shall see. The question is whether or not the team is all right. And the England game really threw up a lot more concerns than reassurances, I would say. And the one bright note in the team, probably through these 2 games in qualifying, Retegui, who scored in both games, has been a big source of conversation. Producer Simon, just before we started, was saying, was expressing some of his reservations about someone jumping in like that, asking whether or not it shouldn't have gone to Scamacca and wouldn't he have scored those goals anyway. Mina, snap thoughts. Retegui in the Italy team, how do you feel about it, sort of in the big picture and after seeing him in these 2 games?
I really like Retegui. Full disclosure, I'm not a big fan of any of our strikers, including Scamacca. Like when he was being linked with the Premier League, I was like, yeah, I can't imagine this being a huge success. I really loved that Scamacca and his journey, and I thought he did a terrific job at Sassuolo, but I just don't think he's a player of the highest caliber to represent the national team. That's not for me to say that Retegui is. But I do sort of see the urgency in needing to look elsewhere and needing to try to find solutions when you sort of don't have a really great number 9. And right now you don't have the players of Zaniolo and Chiesa involved with the national team for various different reasons. It's kind of like, all right, we have a problem in attack. Let's go and look everywhere. So in that way, I understand him coming on, and I think he's done a terrific job. Clearly 2 goals in 2 games. Where I would agree that I don't think it's fair is that you've got players who are born in Italy, raised in Italy, understand the Italian way of playing football, and have to wait up to a certain age before they get an Italian passport and can represent the team. Whereas a player like Retegui, who has, a great grandfather who was born in Sicily, can get the Italian passport and represent the national team, even though he really hasn't been trained in the Italian football ways or has grown up doing that. So, and he's an Argentine in every other aspect, let's say, other than a passport. So for me, I think there's a double standard there that I don't like. And when we are being compared to nations like Switzerland, that's what Mancini was talking about a lot. What they don't understand is that a lot of those are naturalized players. Those players that have come to the country have been raised as Swiss or raised as Belgians or, those different countries and given the passport so that they can represent the national team, whereas Italy don't do that. And I think that's where, I don't want to be looking around at, different corners of the world trying to find somebody who has a bloodline that's Italian. You're Italian when you're born in Italy and lived as an Italian, even if your origins are not from that. That's where I guess it's a political point of view.
See, I fall like completely on the other side of this in the big picture.
Oh.
Because I'm someone who has an Italian dad and who grew up in England, and I always felt a very strong connection to Italy. I always felt like it was a place that I connected to, and I always supported Italy from very young. And I always felt like if that ridiculous question had ever come up, which it didn't, of like, which country would you represent? I would have chosen Italy over England. So I have no problem with someone being born outside of the country. I have no problem with someone relying on their sort of lineage, I guess, like their family. Of course, like on an emotional level, I want them to connect to Italy. That's what bothers me personally. Does Retegui connect to Italy? And that's a question that I can't answer because I haven't sat down with Retegui yet. I haven't spoken to him. I don't know how he feels about it. I would prefer that position not to be going to someone who's just cynically using it, who thinks it's an opportunity to get some exposure, to put myself in a market position, which you could reasonably do, right? Like if he's seeking a move to Europe, this has done him some favors. Like he's now scored some goals in Europe in front of people. But I don't know that he doesn't feel strongly attached to his Italian side. And just because it's only through a grandparent, that's the rules. It's the rules for every country. I have zero problem with that part of it. I think Simon did raise a point before he came on that I agree with more, which is, once Mancini wanted to get Retegui in his team, there was a snap of fingers and this guy had citizenship the next second. Now, citizenship is, he's entitled to it through his grandparent. That's not an obstacle that was ever going to be, even if he didn't play for Italy, that's something he's entitled to. But what pisses you off a bit, if you'd excuse me from saying it, is Mario Balotelli, who was born in Italy and grew up in Italy, wasn't granted citizenship until he was 18 years old. That's disgraceful.
That's the point that I was saying, in the sense that you can be raised there. You don't necessarily have to be of Italian origin, but I still think that you should be given that same sort of benefit of the doubt as you would to somebody who's moved and emigrated abroad.
But I think I'm arguing the same point from the opposite side. I think Balotelli should have got his citizenship much sooner.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I have no problem with Retegui getting it. I just think Balotelli should have been a case. So I think there's hypocrisy in the system that's awful. Do I have a problem with Retegui playing for the national team? No. You know, Mauro Camoranesi was an Oriundo. We were used to Oriundi. They're nothing new. And I not saying that everyone's story is exactly the same, but that part doesn't bother me. And look, in the footballing sense, I also have no problem with not starting Scamacca. Scamacca's been struggling. I think Mancini has given all of his attackers more than a fair crack of the whip. And in the strictly footballing sense, taking aside another part of it, I think he's entitled to call up any new idea he can think of, because the attack's been, using all the wrong words today, but the attack's been crap, Mina.
Yeah, it really has been. I mean, you know, it's interesting because, like, I really have no qualms or any negative thoughts towards the fact that Retegui is playing for us. I'm actually really thrilled by it, because I was like, oh, this guy looks like he's pretty good. You know, I'm happy to have him on board. But I'm also somebody who really believes that you need to connect with your country to do well on that in football. And one of the reasons why, like, I really enjoyed watching countries like Morocco succeed in the World Cup is because you felt like there was a really strong bond with their country, like the representation of their country, their representation of their culture. And that's what I love about Italians. It's like the way they sing the anthem, right? It's like with so much desire and for so much love for their country, like playing for Juventus or playing for the best team in the world, whether it be Milan winning a Champions League or Juventus or Inter or whatever it is. At the end of the day, playing for the national team means 10 times more. And I don't know if that's necessarily the way for teams like, for example, England, where there's always been a lot of question marks with how much they connect with the national team, because the Premier League is so good and it's not the end all and be all of life, but I do feel it's the end all and be all of Italian life. So I do really think it's important for some countries where their players do connect thoroughly with that idea of representing the national team, of being there and doing it sort of the Italian way, rather than, which is again why I hate us particularly copying different styles of football. I much prefer Italians sticking to Italians and not trying to do tiki-taka of Spain, or trying to, I don't know, dribble like the Brazilians or whatever it is. It's the Italian school of thought. Just improve on that, find different ideas, be inspired. But the Italian school of thought is and calcio is, for me, like irreplaceable. I mean, it's so brilliant. Like, you've won four World Cups. Why on earth are you looking around? Just improve upon your ideas. And so on that level, I think that if you are somebody, to be honest with you, we can include Retegui, and we can include any African who has been born and raised as an Italian. As long as you feel Italian and you feel a connection to football, then I don't think there should be a difference between those two. But I would really like the fact if we could just find a few more attackers. I don't care where they come from at this point, hand out passports at immigration if we have to. But it is getting really diabolical with how bad this attack is.
Yeah, it's just to finish that thought on Retegui. I do think part of what a lot of people are struggling with, and which I understand, is like the fact that this is like his first call up and it's straight into competitive games that matter, right? Because like, look at Jorginho. Jorginho was born in Brazil, grew up in Brazil, but he'd played in Italy for a number of years, so at least you sort of felt like that was that sort of connection to Italy, and I think that made it easier for people to just be like, okay, yeah. Whereas I think maybe if Retegui had been called up for some friendlies, started on the bench, like got some time getting used to everyone, felt more like part of the family, it would feel different to how this feels to a lot of people, which is, hang on, he's literally just showed up and there he is, and he's literally the only one scoring goals.
So it's like...
two goals in 2 games. Just to say it, only 3 players I think ever have scored in both their first 2 games for Italy before this, which is Giorgio Chinaglia and Enrico Chiesa and Riccardo Orsolini. So pretty bonkers stuff, actually, in sort of purely like historical terms. So he's come in straight away and scored those 2 goals. And, you know, meanwhile, since the Euros, I don't think that either of Immobile or Belotti has scored a single goal for Italy. So that's how desperate the situation is up front. There's got to be like someone who can put the ball in the net. Obviously, like if you had a healthier Raspadori, you might look at something different. I've seen some people asking just the question of like, tactically, is this necessarily the type of striker Italy need? Would you be better off with like a false 9 type player? I'm open to all of that. I'm open to Raspadori being the one who plays through the middle going forward. But for these 2 games, I do think Mancini has a lot of justifiable complaints. And, you know, when it comes to what his pool of talent available to him is, I think that's certainly justifiable. He's playing without much of a deck, certainly in certain positions like up front. But whether he could be getting more out of the rest of the team is also a valid question. Was there anything else you want to say about that, Mina, about like Mancini and Italy, like how they played? Like, because I haven't really asked you about that.
Well, to be honest with you, I'm not that impressed with what Mancini is doing at the moment. And frankly speaking, if you're asking me whether I prefer Retegui or Jorginho in the team, I want Jorginho out. Like, thank you very much for your service, kind sir. It's been wonderful having you on board and winning Euros with us. But the guy looks like he's 64. And look, I'm going to come out with an admission that I always feel like I don't ever want to do, but I've sort of alluded to it so many times. I'm not always very impressed with Lorenzo Insigne's attitude, but I want to make it clear that I'm a very big fan of the way that he plays his football. I don't think he's somebody that I would like to have my team when their backs against their wall, but I do think he's a very good footballer, you know. Verratti is one that I wouldn't have on my team pretty much ever. And I know that's kind of like a very controversial statement because Verratti seems to be treated as if he's like the second coming of Andrea Pirlo or a great midfielder, but to me, he's never been that. He's just not somebody that I want to stay on my team either. I think that I remember very well when Carlo Ancelotti said he's just the kind of player that you would accept him as he is, or you don't play him. So you have to understand that he's not going to follow instructions. He's going to do what he wants to do, and that's always to attract a lot of risk to this game. And he's a liability for me in midfield. I don't see the energy there. He's getting old. I think that the amount of red cards that he gets for PSG, just like the other day, drives me insane. I always watch him with my hand on my heart thinking, please just calm down, like just don't do anything. And frankly speaking, I preferred Italy in the start of the Euros when they were playing with Locatelli. So I want to see Locatelli. I want to see Sandro Tonali, who was just wonderful. I want to see I want to see Pessina. I want to see Barella. People who who are youngsters who really love their clubs, who really love the Italian national team, and now are of a younger age that can offer just a little more dynamic ability in the middle. And I just don't want to see this whole double pivot. I don't want to see Jorginho. I don't want to hold on the ball. We don't have the skills up front. And with more energy in midfield, then I think we can create a little bit more going forward. And that can help the ability of forward players to do a little bit more, rather than just trying to rotate the ball and keeping possession in the middle. I need more vertical ability there. I'd like to see Fagioli. I'd like to see Miretti. I feel like there's lots of players that we can go to in midfield, but Pessina showed what he can do. And I just really need Sandro Tonali to show that. And Cristante is another one. I think that he is always somebody, we've spoken about it before, but I think he made a difference when he came on and made a difference when he starts. He's never going to be the kind of player that makes you think, wow, the way that sometimes Verratti makes you play, but he offers such consistency that I think it should be recognized and rewarded.
It's interesting because Verratti for me was by far and away the best player in that midfield and against England in the second half. When Italy improved, Verratti was the core of it. Like Verratti was the guy who actually got some things done. I agree to a point in that I think that Verratti is someone who is now he's 30 years old, and he's not really developed beyond a certain kind of player. He's always been this slightly chaotic player who I think tries to do too much, has always tried to do too much and gets in trouble trying to do too much.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a liability for a team to have a player who's trying to do too much. It's been a liability for PSG sometimes, it's been a liability for Italy sometimes. But I don't question his talent at all personally. I think his talent's there. I think his mindset is what has always held him back, unfortunately, that trying to do too much. And but what I think is certainly reasonable is to look around and say, are we clinging too much to that Euro 2020 win because we haven't moved on and the football's not working anymore? And would it be better to be bringing in younger players, giving them the games and letting us build something completely new now? And if we're building something completely new, should it really still be Mancini in charge is a difficult question to ask. When Italy missed World Cup qualifying, I was still more or less still on board with Mancini. I felt like it was just such a ridiculously unlikely set of events that happened. They did just miss penalties against Switzerland that would have qualified them. The game against North Macedonia was one of the craziest games of football I've ever watched. Italy weren't good. They should have been better, but they still lost to the one shot of the game when they'd had 25. Like the way that Italy failed to qualify was ridiculous. So at the time I was still like, you know what? We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Mancini's still the guy. Increasingly, I'm not sure. I'm not. I really wonder if it is time that they just need something different. I don't think it'll happen now in this qualifying campaign. I think this is the manager we're going to have, but I feel like the magic is gone. And perhaps, horrible though it is to acknowledge it, perhaps some of that magic goes with Luca Vialli passing as well. And I don't know that this manager is going to be able to recapture it. I hope I'm wrong. And that Mancini can recapture it because I want him to be the guy, but I'm not sure he is anymore. And that is not fun to admit.
You see, it's a really interesting point because I fully agree with you. The way that Italy didn't qualify for the World Cup, I didn't blame it on Mancini. And I'm somebody who blames Prandelli for the loss in Euro 2012. 2014, should I say. I am a little bit harsh on coaches sometimes, but I do... On this, I agree with you. There were just missed penalties. You feel like it could have been better, but sometimes when I look around and I see the attack, I'm like, how can this be better? It's amazing that we did as well as we did in the Euros, and for that, you have to applaud him. There was something about Roberto Mancini when he got the job. There was just a certain happiness and excitement. It was like a huge, turnover from all the depression that we faced before it. Even obviously not qualifying, Ventura being this, despicable coach at the helm. Although there's a part of me that also feels sorry for him. Antonio Conte saying, what do you want me to do with this terrible generation? And you sort of agree with that as well. And Mancini comes in and all of a sudden you felt like you believed in Italy. You felt like the kids were our bright future and there was happiness and everything exuded positivity and possibilities. And now all of a sudden I just kind of feel like he doesn't enjoy his job. He spends more of his time complaining about the way that life is than actually trying to find solutions or seemingly excited again. So again, I feel like there's this distance once again between Italian fans and the national team, because there's just this kind of well, we didn't qualify again, and now we're losing to England, which hasn't happened since the 60s, and all of these different problems. And here's the thing. So obviously this week we've seen Julian Nagelsmann shifted out of Bayern Munich, even though there was supposed to be this long-term contract and he was the kid that was supposed to grow with Bayern, but instead he has been thrown away. Why? Because Tuchel was available and they were really scared on losing this opportunity in case Real Madrid were looking for a coach at the end of the summer or whatever it be. And I kind of feel like if Ancelotti is going to go to Brazil, there's a part of me that wants to cry. I cannot imagine having Carlo Ancelotti in charge of Brazil and not be in charge of Italy, if any way, shape or form, should we ever manage to qualify for the World Cup, coming up against Carlo Ancelotti's Brazil would fill me with so much fear, And I sort of just, I don't know, if there is a part of me that's if Mancini is going to be depressed, and I don't blame him. I'm not saying to you that, he shouldn't be depressed. I get that he has a lot of complaints about things, but if he's not finding a way through of bringing back that excitement, then maybe he should be able to take over a club and bring in a coach that might be able to do a little bit more. I don't know if the squad is good enough for Carlo. Certainly it's not one that has all the magnificence of Brazil, but it is his national team. And if he is going to leave Real Madrid to play, to coach a national team, I really think it should be Italy.
I think that's a great point that you made just there, Mina. I think actually, you can agree with Mancini, and I do, about the scarcity of talent.
Yeah.
But I think that part of the national team manager's job, and the thing that Mancini did so well, is to tell the story that we can win anyway, and make everyone believe it. You have to make everyone believe it. And I think right now he's not telling that story to us or to his players. And what was different in the Euros was they told the story together and they believed it. They believed that they could win, and they did. And I think as long as this team doesn't believe it can win, it's not a good enough team to win despite that. So you need that optimism from somewhere. Speaking of managers who are available, by the way, I would of course love Carlo to have a stint at some point in charge of the national team. But speaking of managers who are suddenly available, Mina, maybe
No.
this is the moment. Maybe this is the moment for Italy to turn back to Antonio Conte. What do you think?
Even Simon, even producers is doing the slicing the neck action. No. Can you imagine? You sit there being like, can't we just buy players and give them passports? Listen, it's not like he did a bad job for Italy by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
You did a pretty good job actually with Italy, probably better than I expected, certainly. Although
he had us believing in Eder and Graziano Pele as a centre forward partnership. Like, come on, that was a special era.
I just don't think his brand of football will ever succeed in these types of, like, as in short recoveries. You know, it's just it's too exhaustive. I still think he's one dimensional. I know that we greatly disagree on that, but yeah, let's just say that I think there is, and I certainly don't want it to be De Zerbi. So I'm fearful of that more than anything. Like, I'd rather have Conte than De Zerbi if those are the two options.
Wow.
You know? So I want neither. I want Ancelotti, and if it's not Ancelotti, then I don't know, Allegri or Pioli would be fine with me.
We did a little. I did it quite on my Twitter. We've done
Actually,
quite in general
for
questions for this podcast. I got one on Twitter, Mina, from Anthony Kennedy, asking, where does Conte go from here? I think it's an interesting question. Where do you think? Because obviously we probably should give our takes on Conte more generally, but Antonio Conte, obviously, in case anyone's living under a rock, has left Tottenham by mutual consent. This is how Antonio Conte leaves clubs, which is kick off at everyone and everything. Yeah, like set everything on fire, and then but never quit, because if you quit, you don't get your severance. So that's why it's always mutual consent. And so, where does Antonio Conte go from here, Mina? Like, he's certainly burned some bridges, I feel like, with the way he's exited here. I think it's sort of amazing that Stellini is staying on, at least in the short term, to be the caretaker manager. That sort of feels bizarre. But Conte, is there a job waiting for him in Italy? What do you think?
Well, it's an interesting one, because I don't think it's Juventus, even though people love to associate him to Juventus. I think that ship has sailed largely because Juve don't have that much money to spend anymore. They are trying to sort of prioritize the nurture of the young kids, next gen, that project that will come through. We don't know what's going to happen to them with the trial. Obviously, we're still waiting on that. And so I'm not sure that is a match made in heaven. Frankly speaking, he's somebody that needs a lot of investment on the market. Instead, he's going to be working with a lot of kids. I'm not sure that interests him. Although Juve is Juve, and I'm sure that there's always a path to it, but I don't think Allegri is leaving anytime soon. And frankly speaking, if you ask me between the two, I'd much rather hope that Allegri stays for a long time if the other choice is Conte. Again, Milan, sustainable project, not willing to spend money. You know, their huge investment was Di Cattelare, and everyone's talking about it not working out for them. They're not the team that's going to spend 50 million on bringing in the likes of Achraf Hakimi or anyone that Conte loves in particular. Inter's the only reasonable destination, frankly speaking, because I think Inzaghi has been good for them, and perhaps the best that they could have hoped for after Conte left. But Conte was the guy that changed this team's dynamic and mentality and their attitude. And you could see there's a huge drop-off since he left. It's just not Inter. And yes, a lot of that has to do with the fact that they did lose Lukaku for a year, and the person that's returned is not yet the actual Lukaku. I think they miss the whole staff that Antonio Conte brought with him as well. I think they miss just this ambition that he has. From a mentality point of view, I think that he's brilliant. He really knows how to sort of lock in and develop this willingness to fight for every match. It's not just the big matches, it's every match. So I just can't imagine that if Conte was at the helm that they'd be losing to sides or drawing against the likes of Sampdoria. And having suffered the 9 wins, like hardly any of them came against the big teams, you know, other than, of course, Juventus. But otherwise, you know, but again, I had to. But it's, although it was very controversial, and they probably should. Anyway, but point is that they are a team that could do with an Antonio Conte, but it's also a team that's trying to lower their wage bill, that's trying to not spend money, that will probably have to sell some of their best players, that will be without Skriniar, might be without Lukaku as well. And so where's this money coming from? And the guy asks for a lot of money. Like, it's 12 million his contract plus 2 in bonuses, so it's 14 million overall. And so it's not like the guy comes cheap. He's being paid 17 million at Spurs. So who on earth can afford an Antonio Conte, who then wants about an investment of 200 million into the squad anyway? Like, who can afford him?
I think it's a really big question. Like, who can afford him anywhere? And it's not many clubs, and like the clubs that you think maybe could have done, it's hard to find one that's looking right now. You know, a club like Manchester United that aspires to win the league, I can see how that could have been a fit before, but they've got a manager that's working for them right now, so like that's not going to happen.
What about PSG?
Maybe it's his time at PSG. I can imagine that going in some quite spectacular flames when the time comes, but maybe for a year or two it will work quite well, because he certainly, well, I mean, he'll still find a way to complain about not getting all the players he wants, but at least in theory, it would be at least in theory, you know, he's someone who delivers titles. Although, of course, he also famously is least effective in Europe, and that's probably the title they actually want, isn't it? So I don't know. Honest answer, I expect Conte to take some time out. I think he's much less sort of... I think he needs football less than people imagine he does. I think he actually is someone who takes some time out of football. He's done it before and doesn't mind doing that. So I don't think he's going to bounce straight into a job.
I also think he suffered quite a lot with some of the losses that we've had recently.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
Yeah, and for that I feel sorry for him, and I do feel like he wants to be closer to home. That there is a part of him that's like a little bit fed up of the whole circus. Maybe it's
he's one of those characters, isn't he? Like it's one of those things though, like, do you know how on like on every single reality show and in real life as well, sometimes there's like someone who will like say, oh my god, you know what I hate drama, I hate the drama, and you know that person is the drama. I feel like that's Antonio Conte. Like, wherever he goes, he's like, oh, I just want things to be like calm and work, and like you're the reason. Like, you're the reason it doesn't. Like, you're the one causing this drama. I almost I'm sad I wasn't better prepared for this show, because I did think to myself it would have been funny to get like a bunch of his quotes from the final months at Inter and Juventus and Tottenham, and then like do a quiz and see if you could guess which was which, because I'm sure they sound the same. I'm convinced that like, okay, the topics change slightly. You know, at Inter it was no one protects me from the referees like they did when I was at Juventus. At Juventus it was, how are we supposed to win when we haven't got any money? At Tottenham it's this thing about, oh, you always expect the manager to speak and not the medical staff, which again, like individually you can agree with him on some things, but it always ends up in the same narrative of I'm not getting everything I need. And I wondered if you could do that with quotes and like put them together and do a Q&A and make it hard to guess. I bet you could. But this leads us into a question we had from one of our Chronicles Tifosi, Mina. Michael Byetts wrote in to ask, what is a manager's job? How much does it depend on the club he's going to? Consider Conte, Mourinho, Pioli and Spalletti. Conte and Mourinho have won big things, but only when brought into clubs with everything else in place. They've failed at clubs with holes, weaknesses and problems. Drop either into 2019 Milan or 2021 Napoli and it's a disaster. But if I owned Bayern, Man City or Real Madrid, I might hire Conte. What do you think of Michael's question?
It depends, because there are so many different types of coaches, right? So you've got coaches who are builders, not necessarily winners, like Ranieri was always famous for being that. Then you have coaches who are managers as well as being coaches. And by that, I mean they have the task of like helping to scout the players that they want, to build the kind of football that they want, which I think Klopp is part of that. You know, Klopp identifies very quickly what kind of players that he needs in his system to do well. And luckily, they don't all come with a ginormous transfer value. And he has the style of football that he tries to make work. But he works within a team of doing that as a manager. So does Guardiola, right? And then you have the tacticians who are there to make the most of what they have. Perhaps, you know, you could say some of them are company men, a bit like Spalletti and Pioli, who are there to just be with the club and be devoted to the club and try to do the best they can with the players they have at hand. And then you have the psychologists, the warriors, the mental warriors. And I do, I'm Antonio Conte falls into that bracket, and so does Jose Mourinho. Obviously, they've won different levels. Like, you can always depend on Conte to win you a team, like a Scudetto or a title. Maybe not with Spurs, but obviously with teams that are capable. But Mourinho is somebody that does it on a much grander scale, because he can win you Champions Leagues and he can win you the big trophies in Europe as well. And I do think a lot of sort of, even when he has failed, like, people always try to accuse him of being in Real Madrid, he is somebody who laid the groundwork for the mentality change that shifted them from losing in the in the knockout stages to teams like Lyon, to being a side that could challenge in semi-finals. And I do think a lot of that had to do with Mourinho changing the mentality in them, to then bring in the likes of Carlo Ancelotti and Zinedine Zidane, who took that team onwards and upwards, and they did a terrific job in doing that. So there's a lot to be said about Mourinho. I think that he's crazy. I think that I'm never going to be a huge fan of some of the football that he's produced, but I do think from a mental point of view, he's one of the absolute best. Mm-hmm. And so is Conte, but Conte just needs a lot of investment. It's a lot of drama, and it's always, I mean, for both of them, really always seems to end in massive, like, tears, right? So yes, if you are a team, here's the thing. If you want Antonio Conte, then you have to be a team that doesn't have massive egos, or a team that's of a huge stature. I know that sounds crazy because he coached both Juventus and Inter, but it's a team that needs to be on the cusp of winning great things. And even though Juve, he took it from 7th to first, he was working as part of a team that had regenerated everything at management level. And I think that's important to take. We always talk about it being Conte, but it was a huge team effort as well. I do think there was a great importance in Marotta being brought in Agnelli changing things and giving him the license to do that, and the freedom he was given in knowing the club's values, the club's DNA. And he changed that. And that was probably his greatest success, is changing all of it from being a team that finished 7th to being a team that can win the title. But otherwise, if I'm going forward, I need to have a team that's on the cusp of winning things before I bring Conte. And it can't be a side that has sort of frankly speaking, the reputation of Manchester United, because I honestly don't think big players want to work with him. And I know that because Sergio Ramos didn't want to work with him. He said, I'm not going to play for a guy who's going to sit there and micromanage me. And a lot of these big players don't want that. They don't want that. They didn't like it with Jose Mourinho. They made sure that they expressed that quite ferociously. And this is kind of why I think Carlo Ancelotti works with them so well, because he's like this nice guy who smiles a lot at them and sort of appreciates the experience that they bring. And so you need to bring in Antonio Conte to a side that is like not performing because of the psychological level, but not because, it's a Bayern Munich. Like, Conte and Bayern Munich for me would be terrible, because I can't imagine the likes of Joshua Kimmich and Muller being all right with Conte being like, no, I've told you need to track back here. And I think that it will just be a disaster. But I do think if he goes sort of a Borussia Dortmund and changing the mentality to really challenge Bayern, I think he might be great at that, so to provide consistency. But I just don't think he works well with giant egos.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question that Michael sort of brought up. And I think we've touched on aspects of it before, of like what a manager's job is. And that's changed so much if you think about, certainly much more in English football than in say Italian football, where this idea of like a separation of church and state, if you will, between the allenatore, which literally means the trainer, the one who's coaching the players, and the sporting directors who do the transfer stuff. In England in the 90s, it was very much one job, and I think Arsene Wenger is often described as like the last great sort of like trying to do everything manager, rather than someone who's brought in to do the specifics. But I think even if you just talk about them as managers, as just the coaching aspect, even within that, there's huge, I think, differences of opinion between managers about what the most important part of their job is. And I still remember talking to Stefano Pioli when he was on the way to winning the Scudetto with Milan, and he was saying, like, there's this sort of technical, tactical part of football, but my staff can help me with that. Like, my staff can help me get my tactics right. My job is to work on the mindset of the players, to like get under their skin, make sure I'm pushing the right buttons, make sure I'm getting them to where they need to go. And I don't think every manager would agree with that at all. I think some managers would say, no, my job is to like, get those tactics right and to get those things how they need to be.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was saying that's what Pioli said.
Jump in. That was what Pioli told me, yeah.
Do you think that's what Spalletti's doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think Spalletti is probably less sort of tactics obsessed than he is with other parts of the game for sure.
You think he's less tactics obsessed?
Well, his tactics are very fluid. I think maybe tactics is the wrong word for what Spalletti does. So tactically, I think he's very sort of, he wants his team to be responsive. But I think he's worked on making his team understand how to be responsive. So I suppose that is tactical. I don't know.
Yeah, I just wonder whether here's the thing, right? You have a club and then you have an identity. So Barcelona's identity is they play a certain style of football. It's always got to be fascinating to watch. Like they're not going to be a team that wins it the Juve way, you know. And then you have teams like Juventus and Real Madrid who are more about buying the individuals and then making that into a team. So and Chelsea as well. And so then you have to bring in a coach who is pragmatic enough to take that on board and then figure out a way of making that win. It could be through dull tactics, it could be through Spalletti tactics, but it's pragmatism at its highest order, right? They are not wedded to a certain style of play. But for example, with an Ancelotti and Allegri, their in-game management makes all the difference. Whereas somebody like Spalletti he can bring out the best in a group of players, and so can Pioli actually, you know. But from a tactical point of view, I think Conte and Mourinho fall far below that in their ability to change on a tactical level and to develop the game and to produce the kind of football that we're all interested in seeing. But what they do develop is a great individual who has this hunger to win and to go above and beyond what they can do. And that worries me with Conte because I feel like he relies so much on a starting 11 that if that starting 11 starts to fall apart, then he doesn't really have a plan B. For Mourinho, though, he can make that starting 11 do wonders in both, you know, the league and in Europe. And so that is remarkable too. But Mourinho works better with older players, right? He, like he said, give me all the older players and I'll win everything for you. And I actually believe him because I just really think right now, if you, even all the ones that have retired, you give him a Pirlo and Drogba, and I still think that right now he'd probably win Serie A if he had that team. So yeah, and then you have Inzaghi, who I think is a great tactician, but just doesn't know what to do on a mental level. And I think that's where he struggles, for example. So I don't know. It's about where your team is, you know, and what you have. Like Pioli is just the perfect manager for Milan, not because he's the perfect manager, but because it's right place, right time. You know, it's about developing kids. It's about having a sustainable project. It's about showing patience. It's about accepting that you don't have that a lot of money to spend, you know, and having to do what you can with what you have. And I think that's why he's perfect in that sense. I think Allegri is great because he took a team that was doing very well, but just made them believe in themselves a little bit more in Europe, you know. In-game management made all the difference because he didn't micromanage them. He developed them into leaders who can make the right decisions at the right time. And so it's as that's what Carlo Ancelotti's superpower is. So it's about what you need right now. But Manchester United, I wasn't entirely sure they needed a Ten Hag, but actually he's exactly the guy that they needed. So it's about what, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that like the answer of what the manager's job is, I think it's fluid, and I think to some extent the manager's job is what they say it is, and then the rest falls to like how they structure their staff. I mean, I think if you want someone who very clearly sets the tactical identity of their team, you could point to obviously like historically Arrigo Sacchi would be a great example because like no one's more insistent on one way of playing football than Arrigo Sacchi. But I think in modern terms, you could say Gasperini. Like Gasperini's tactics are like essential. Like their whole identity comes from his way of playing football, and that comes from him. And then I think you've got managers who think their role is.
Gasperini.
No, he's not really stubborn. But I
like
think
Pep is stubborn.
Yes, yeah. I just mean in terms of like what the manager's job is, which is the first part of Michael's question. Like, is it to be the tactical leader? Gasperini, yes. Pep's another great example. Yes, Pep is like the one who decides like the whole like idea of the team. And I think there's other managers who don't see their job like that, like Pioli, who says, well, my job's to get into the players' skin and make them get the best of themselves, and we can work out the tactics together. Like that I think is like two different ways of a manager conceiving their own role. And I think both can work. And I think, you know, for some like Mourinho, I think that Mourinho is tactically quite sort of has his firm ideas. But I still think if you ask Mourinho what the most important part of a manager's job is, I think he'll think it is some greater overarching idea of being a leader and of being like, you know, you need to follow my style and my like mindset and like the all-in mentality. So I think it really changes. And I think there's different ways to be successful as long as you've got the staff around you to work. For who?
Like, let's say you're building a club and you can afford to spend 100 million in the transfer market, but
Mhm.
the players that you have right now are good, but they're young. And so
That's a good question. I don't know. And this is where you get to like the conversation. We've definitely had this conversation before. Like Carlo Ancelotti is a great manager for Real Madrid. He wasn't a great manager for Everton. I wouldn't hire Carlo
or
Ancelotti for
Bayern.
that job. So I don't know. Right now in Italian football, Pioli's certainly shown he can work with young players very effectively. I will drive Mina mad by saying I do like De Zerbi. I think he brings enthusiasm to a situation, which I think is part of what you need for young players. I think it depends on the profile of the young players you've got to some extent as well. I wouldn't want Ivan Juric if I felt like the strength of my team was young creative players. But if I felt like I've got some good defenders and I want to build them up, sure, get Juric in, make this team physical and aggressive and lean into that. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's kind of the point, is I can't give you one manager for every job.
Yeah, I know. I struggled with that too, even though I have my favorites. I think they all need to be brought in the right time. So I don't, like, I love a Saudi, right? But then I just feel like that comes with a lot of problems as well. But probably
Yeah.
Spalletti would be actually my choice, to be
Spalletti,
honest.
of course. Yeah. Let's talk about Napoli actually, Mina, because we've got a question from Giancarlo Arnese saying, it seems like every team looks tired except for Napoli. Do you think they've hit on something different with how they're managing their players? They seem not to rotate their starting lineup as much as other teams, or do you think it's more their superior quality gives them a lift that other teams just can't get? What do you think, Mina?
You know, this is something that I debate in my head so much because this has been the most interesting part of like this whole Napoli business, right? And it's also interesting to see how the papers have analyzed it, because it's a case of, why don't we just rest the likes of Lobotka and introduce maybe Ndombele more, having other players just brought in and rotating the squad a little bit. And it was interesting because Sarri always depended on his starting 11, whereas when Carlo Ancelotti came in, he rotated a little bit more and made everyone feel part of the group, and everyone thought that's why they were like look so happy. And then obviously that fell apart too. Then you see teams such as, for example, Atletico Madrid, when they won the title and then made a run to the Champions League final and lost because, really narrowly lost to Real Madrid. And they started almost the same 11 in every single match. And you thought, how have you not fallen apart at this stage? Like, how is it possible that you can, like, oh, you're just so lucky to do this, Then there are other teams like Luis Enrique's Barcelona that won the treble. Very different into obviously Pep's, but he rotated that squad so massively at the start of the season that people thought he didn't even know what his starting 11 was. And he kept saying, this will work out. I just need to give them all minutes so that I have different choices when it comes to the important games. And everyone thought no one's going to buy into this. But actually it worked, because then he had all these options. He could play possession football. He could be vertical. They were fantastic in the Champions League and they won it. They won everything. And so what does it take? Honestly, I really believe that when you're happy and you're winning, there's something to be said about the psychology of it all. It's a little bit like Allegri always says that when a player is down, he's more susceptible to an injury. And so he tries not to include players who he feels are mentally having an issue right now, or feeling very depressed because he thinks their injury will get worse if they have a small one, or that there's psychosomatic. It's just, is that what you say? I don't know the word. Is that, but it's
Psychosomatic?
yeah, and it's all in your head. I honestly can't tell you, because Juventus under Conte played the starting 11 a lot of the time in their first season, and they did an exceptionally good job. You could say they weren't playing in Europe very well because they weren't in Europe at all in the first season. So maybe that makes a difference. But Napoli is doing it in every competition other than the Coppa Italia, because they got knocked out by Cremonese, of all teams. But anyway, it is, I think, the joy of their football. It is the fact that it's in right now. It's just that interesting, like, we can do it, we're doing so well, we're really making it work. They have players who want to be included in every single match. They don't want to be recovering. They're feeling like they're about to make history. And I think on a psychological level, that adds a little bit more to something than, say, a team like perhaps Inter, who are being so heavily criticized, that you sort of lose that will, because you think, even if I fight really hard, I'm not going to win the Scudetto, so what's the point, And so I do understand that a little bit more. So should you rotate? Should you bring people who want to make more of an effort? Should you include the kids? And I think it's a good question to have, but I still somebody who firmly believes in psychology, and it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I think Alex Ferguson talked about that with the treble. Like, I'd rather be playing every 3 games because if we're winning, then everyone's happy, and when you're happy, you
Yeah.
do well. I think there's a more mundane thing that I'm pointing to as well, which is look, who are the two most important players in this team? We've talked about this quality through the team, the depth, all of that. Two most important players in this team. I don't think anyone would disagree. Victor Osimhen and Kvaratskhelia of the season they're having, right? Neither of them went to the World Cup. Now let's look at this from another perspective. Minutes played in Serie A this season. Who's played the most minutes for Napoli? Giovanni Di Lorenzo didn't go to the World Cup. Alex Meret didn't go to the World Cup. Kim Min-jae did go to the World Cup. But then you've got Stanislav Lobotka didn't go to the World Cup. Anguissa, again, did go to the World Cup. But then you've got Osimhen, didn't go to the World Cup. Kvaratskhelia didn't go to the World Cup. A lot of the most important players in this team, a lot of the ones who are playing the most, did not have to play in Qatar, so they have fewer minutes in their legs. I don't think that's the only reason. I don't want to point to that and say, well, that's the reason, because I'm sure you could do that with some of the other teams as well. But it helps. If you're asking why people aren't tired, having 2 months off in the middle of the season helps. So I do think that's a factor in this as well, is that actually just a lot of important players in this team
Especially
didn't
when
have
you
to
look
do
at
that.
especially when you look at Giroud and Theo Hernandez's form, right, after the World Cup.
Yeah.
Because we could see a big dip there, and everyone was pointing to the fact that they were exhausted by the time they reached the final.
Right. And that's why even if you look at someone like Kim Min-jae, who, yes, did go to the World Cup, South Korea weren't there for that long. He played 3 games, whereas playing all the way to the final, I think, probably has a big impact as well. So I think probably Argentinian and French players in particular, not surprising that those players who tend to... The other thing is as well, like, those teams went to the final, and so those players particularly tired. Also, those players tend to be really important players for their club sides, because if you're good enough to go to a World Cup final, you're probably quite good. So
It was fine, right? And so you all
that's
wonder,
true.
like how
Yeah.
come he didn't suffer? And actually, he's one of the few that hasn't suffered an injury. That Juventus is, terrible injury record. He's touch wood now. I don't hope nothing happens to him. But then, you have like Sofiane Amrabat, who was important to Fiorentina at the start of the season, then went to that World Cup and then came back broken. And there was just a lot of shade thrown in Italiano's way as to why he wasn't playing him. And he said, "The guy's on injections. I can't include him right now." And so. Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, you're right about the World Cup. It makes a difference. It does. It absolutely makes a difference. But I don't know why it just hasn't for some players.
Yeah. We've got more questions I'd love to get to, but I think we're out of time for this podcast. Unfortunately, we got a couple in. We got 3 in, I think. I'd love to do more. We'll have to do more in the future. But yes, we are short of time for today. Mina, it was awesome to have you back with me. Much as I enjoyed talking to myself for 20 minutes or half an hour, as I managed to on some of those. I'll peel back the curtain for everyone for a second. My voice note after the Derby d'Italia and the Derby di Roma last weekend, I did a voice note and I sent it to Simon, which became the episode. I did video that as well on my phone. I was going to try to send it to Simon so he could do it as a video thing, and then it was like 7.5 gigs and I could not work out how to transfer it to Simon. So sorry to everyone who wanted the video. I physically couldn't work out how to get it to him. I tried to upload it to Google Drive and it went for just like days and nothing happened. So that was not very successful. Let's do some quick shout outs to our new Chronicles Tifosi. Mina, are you up for splitting the list with me?
Always.
So thank you so much, New Chronicles Tifosi, supporting the show on Patreon. Thank you to Max, just Max, taking it to the max at the start of this list. Moon Kid, again, just the one name, Moon Kid. Callum Alston and Matthew Ulmes.
Also, thank you to, I wonder if it's Max Verstappen. I'm joking. Thank you to Oludaji, Christopher. Is that how you'd go for that?
Maybe Nygren? I'm not sure.
Nygren?
NYGRN, in case anyone's wondering.
Yes. Oh, and also, Christopher, if you want, you can send us a voice note of how we can pronounce your name, like Decathlon did for Milan. Thank you to Katia Fitness and to Andrew Mitchell. Welcome. We hope you're enjoying the show. Oh, it's annoying that this is all we have time for. But we are excited for Serie A returning, that's for sure. So it should be really exciting to see whether or not Napoli is going to drop 18 points and we have a title race. So Let's see what happens there. But do find us on Twitter at Nicky Bandini, at Mina Rzouki. Subscribe to Serie Chronicles on YouTube for clips and shorts. These are the little videos on the show. We will try to get through to your questions. Hopefully, we might do them as a voice note. That could be an interesting way of answering some of them. Do come back to us if you perhaps if you had a little club and you had some good players, but you were looking to buy some stars, who you want as your coach in Serie A. That could be an interesting one. If everyone replies Antonio Conte, you will be blacked from them. I'm joking. Do tell us, even if it's Antonio Conte. I will take your opinion on board. That is all we have time for. We will be back with you at normal time next week. Thank you for listening, and ciao for now.
Serie Chronicles is a Media Chronicles production.